General Grievous was not born as the monster that haunted the Clone Wars. He was created. The stories told of him paint a picture of a warlord without mercy, a figure of terror who cut down Jedi with mechanical precision and led an army of mindless droids against the Republic. His name was spoken in hushed tones by clone troopers, whispered in fear by young Padawans who knew that facing him often meant certain death. To the Republic, he was a relentless executioner. To the Separatists, he was the ultimate weapon. But to the Jedi, he was something far worse. Proof that they were not untouchable, that even those without the Force could learn to kill them. There was a time when he was not a weapon of war, but a warrior of flesh and blood. Before the metal shell, before the mask, before the cold, digitized voice, he had a name, Kiman Shal, a warlord from a distant world few in the Republic had ever cared about. His people knew him as a protector, a leader who fought to keep their way of life from being destroyed. But the galaxy did not reward warriors like him. It used them. It broke them. And in the end, it reforged them into something unnatural. To understand Grievous, one must understand what he lost. His body was not simply enhanced. It was stripped away. His mind was not merely sharpened. It was twisted into something unrecognizable. The rage that burned within him was not the product of ambition. It was the result of betrayal. He did not wake up one day and decide to become the Jedi's worst nightmare. That decision was made for him, piece by piece, as those in power molded him into something they could use. War is often seen as a battle of ideals, of armies clashing over principles, but for those who fight, it is rarely so simple. The Clone Wars were engineered for a single purpose: destruction. And General Grievous was one of its greatest tools. He was meant to tear through the Jedi, to exhaust them, to weaken their order until they could no longer resist what was coming. He believed he was fighting for victory. In truth, he was only ensuring his own demise, but he did not see it that way. He saw himself as a warrior who had adapted to a changing battlefield. The Republic had abandoned honor long before he ever picked up a lightsaber. The Jedi had turned a blind eye to the suffering of his people. If they saw him as a monster, he would become one. If they feared his methods, he would make them fear him even more. There was no room for hesitation, no room for mercy. Those were the weaknesses of the Jedi, and he had cast them aside long ago. His transformation mirrored the war itself, slow, insidious, and inevitable. The Republic did not recognize its own decay until it was too late. Neither did he. What began as a fight for survival became something unrecognizable. The warrior who had once bled for his people became something else entirely. The warlord became a machine. The protector became a hunter. And the man who once had a name became nothing more than a ghost, haunting the battlefield, striking from the shadows, a reminder that even legends could be shattered. This is the story of General Grievous. But before the droid armies, before the lightsabers, before the war that would consume him, we must go back to Kalee, to the world that made him, to the battles that defined him, to the moment everything changed. Kalee was not a world of peace. Its jagged cliffs, vast deserts, and dense jungles were a constant reminder that survival was never guaranteed. The planet's skies burned red beneath a sun that showed no mercy, and its land was shaped by the struggles of those who lived there. Every beast, every storm, every shifting dune seemed determined to break those who called this place home. It was a world where only the strong endured, where weakness was never an option. The Kalee were molded by this unforgiving land. Their way of life had been built on war, not by choice, but by necessity. Every generation was raised to fight, not just against rival clans, but against the monstrous creatures that stalked the wilderness. The greatest of these, the Mumu, were towering reptiles with armor-like hides and jaws strong enough to crush stone. To kill one was not just an act of survival, it was a rite of passage. Those who succeeded would carve masks from the beast's bones, marking themselves as warriors. A Kalee without a mask was a child. A warrior without one was a disgrace. The bone mask was more than decoration. It carried the weight of ancestry, the spirit of those who had fought and bled before. The Kalee believed that their warriors did not truly die, but lived on through the masks, watching over those who continued the fight. To lose one's mask in battle was a fate worse than death. It meant severing the connection to the past, a sign of dishonor that could never be undone. This belief shaped their every action. They fought not just for themselves, but for the warriors who had come before, for the families who depended on them, for the gods who demanded strength. Among the many clans of Kalee, one name rose above the rest: Kiman Shal. Even as a child, he had shown a rare understanding of battle. While others fought with strength alone, he fought with strategy, turning the terrain itself into a weapon. He understood the way the dunes shifted in the wind, how the cliffs could be used to funnel an enemy into a kill zone, how the dense jungles provided cover for an ambush. He was a warrior long before he earned the title. War was never far from Kalee. For as long as the Kalee had existed, they had fought against each other, locked in endless struggles over land, honor, and survival. But their greatest enemy did not come from within. It came from the stars. The Yamri, an insectoid species known to the Republic as the Huk, saw Kalee as nothing more than a resource. Their colonies spread across the planet, consuming everything in their path. The Kalee resisted, but the Huk had weapons far beyond anything they had ever faced. The battles that followed would shape the fate of their greatest warrior, setting him on a path that would take him far beyond the sands of his homeworld. For the Kalee, war was not something that could be avoided. It was woven into their existence, as natural as breathing. It was the only way to protect their land, their people, and the memory of those who had come before. As long as there were enemies to fight, warriors would rise to meet them. And in the coming war, none would rise higher than Kiman Shal. Kiman Shal was born into war. His earliest memories were not of peace, but of struggle, skirmishes between rival clans, the hunt for food, the never-ending fight for survival. Among the Kalee, childhood was brief. The moment a child could lift a weapon, they were expected to train. For Kiman, this training began the same way it had for generations before him, with a spear in hand and a lesson in blood. He was raised in one of Kalee's most respected warrior clans, a lineage that traced itself back through countless battles. The Kalee did not measure status by wealth or titles. Leadership was earned through strength, cunning, and the ability to defend one's people. From the beginning, Kiman understood this. His father was a warrior, his mother a strategist, and their expectations were clear. He was not just their son, he was their legacy. His survival meant the continuation of their bloodline, and failure was not an option. Training was brutal. The first lesson was how to track prey across the dunes, reading the subtle shifts in sand to predict movement. The second was how to fight, first with a spear, then with a blade, then with his bare hands. There was no ceremony, no encouragement, only the expectation that he would endure. The moment he showed hesitation, he was struck down. The moment he showed weakness, he was tested harder. By the time he reached his first hunt, he had already learned the most important lesson of all. Hesitation could kill faster than any enemy. The true test came with the Mumu hunt. Every Kaleesh warrior was expected to slay one of these beasts to earn their mask. Most attempted the trial in their late teens, but Kiman was barely into his 12th year when he took his spear and set out alone. The Mumu was larger than any creature he had faced before, towering over him with scales like iron and a mouth filled with teeth that could rip through stone. Many before him had failed, some had died, but he did not hesitate. He moved fast, watching for the openings his elders had taught him to find. A clean strike to the eye, a swift cut to the throat. It was over before the creature even understood it was being hunted. When he returned to his village carrying the beast's skull, there was no need for words. His place was secured. The bone mask was carved. His first true weapon was gifted to him, and from that moment, he was recognized as a warrior. His reputation grew quickly. He learned to command not just through force, but through strategy. He studied the battles of his ancestors, memorizing formations and tactics. By the time he saw his first real war against an opposing clan, he was not simply fighting, he was leading. Every decision was precise, every attack calculated. He understood the battlefield as if it were part of him, and his victories ensured that he was no longer seen as a warrior among many, but as a leader in the making. Kiman Shal had proven himself. The next battles would prove far greater. The war began with fire. The Yamri, known to the Republic as the Huk, descended on Kalee in force, their ships blotting out the sun, their armies spreading across the land like a sickness. They came not as conquerors, but as takers. Their species had long expanded through violence, stripping weaker worlds of their resources and leaving little behind. To them, Kalee was nothing more than another prize. To the Kaleesh, it was their home, and they would not surrender it without a fight. The Huk were different from the enemies the Kaleesh had faced before. Their exoskeletons made them difficult to kill, their weapons were more advanced, and their ships allowed them to strike without warning. They did not fight for survival, they fought for control, and they had no intention of leaving. The first battles were devastating. Villages burned, warriors fell, and entire clans were wiped from history. The Kaleesh fought back with everything they had, but spears and blades could only do so much against starships and energy weapons. Kiman Shal was already a respected leader when the war began, but in those early days he became something more. He was not just a warrior, he was a tactician, a strategist who understood that brute force would not win this war. He abandoned the open battlefield, pulling his warriors into the shadows. The jungles, the mountains, the shifting dunes, these became weapons in his hands. Where the Huk relied on numbers and firepower, the Kaleesh relied on the land itself. Guerrilla warfare became their greatest strength. The Huk could not fight what they could not see. Patrols vanished in the night, their bodies found days later, stripped of weapons and armor. Supply lines were disrupted, their food stolen before it could reach their troops. The Kaleesh could not match the Huk's numbers, so they made every battle one-sided. They did not fight fair, because fair fights were a luxury their people could not afford. Kiman led from the front. He knew the terrain better than anyone, could track an enemy through the sands long after their footprints had disappeared. He struck fast, hit hard, and disappeared before the Huk could react. Each victory inspired more warriors to take up arms, and soon the war shifted. The Huk, once confident in their superiority, began to hesitate. They fortified their positions, pulled back from the front lines, tried to control the war through fear instead of force. But fear did not break the Kaleesh. It only hardened them. The war dragged on, a conflict of attrition where every loss cost the Kaleesh more than they could afford. Villages fell, families were torn apart, and the land itself bore the scars of battle. But they fought on. They fought not because they thought they could win, but because surrender was never an option. For years, Kalee bled, but it did not break. And at the heart of the war stood Kiman Shal, no longer just a warrior or a leader, but a symbol, a living reminder that Kalee was not a world to be taken without a cost. Victory, if it ever existed, was not measured in battles won, but in the number of Kaleesh still left standing. For years, they had fought against the Huk, outmatched in weaponry, but never in will. They had turned ambushes into art, transformed the very land beneath their feet into a weapon. Slowly, the tide had begun to shift. The Huk, despite their technology, could not wipe them out. They had grown cautious, hesitant. And then, just as the Kaleesh saw a path to reclaiming what was theirs, the Republic intervened. But it was not to stop the invaders. It was to punish the defenders. The Huk, beaten but not broken, played their final hand not on the battlefield, but in the Senate halls of Coruscant. They painted themselves as the victims, spinning tales of war crimes, of brutal Kaleesh warlords slaughtering innocent civilians. They omitted the villages they had raised, the families they had enslaved, the horrors they had inflicted upon Kalee. Instead, they draped themselves in the cloak of victimhood, appealing to the Republic's sense of justice. And the Republic listened. The Jedi, guardians of peace, enforcers of balance, were called upon to act. But they did not arrive to stop the invaders. They did not land on Kalee to mediate, to understand, to see the truth. They did what they had always done, served the will of the Senate without question. Their judgment was swift and absolute. The Kaleesh were branded as aggressors, the true story of the war erased by the bureaucrats who preferred the version that suited them. Kalee was placed under Republic sanctions, its trade routes cut off, its people left to starve. For Kiman Shal, it was the first true betrayal. The Huk had always been the enemy. There was no illusion about that. But the Republic, the Jedi, they had positioned themselves as peacekeepers, warriors of justice who fought for the oppressed. That was the lie he had believed. That was the illusion that shattered when he watched his people, already battered by war, now condemned to slow, quiet suffering. The battlefields had once been filled with warriors ready to fight for survival. Now they were filled with the starving, the sick, the abandoned. And the Jedi never came back. They passed their judgment, enforced their will, and left Kalee to rot. Hatred was not born in a single moment. It grew, fed by every starving child, every mother who could no longer provide for her family, every warrior who had fought to protect his home, only to see it fall, not to an enemy's blade, but to the indifference of the Republic. The Huk were monsters, but the Republic had enabled them. The Jedi had given them their approval. And that, more than anything, was something Kiman could not forgive. The war against the Huk had been one of survival. The war that now burned within him was something else entirely. The Republic had taken everything. The Jedi had shown their true nature, and one day they would pay for their mistake. Kalee was dying. The war had taken its toll, but the Republic's sanctions had done what the Huk never could, turned the land barren, drained the people of hope, and left them clinging to survival with nothing but desperation. There were no more warriors, only the starving. The once proud cities had become graveyards, the few remaining settlements filled with those who had once fought, but now struggled to find a reason to keep going. Kiman Shal had fought his entire life to protect his people. He had led them through a war against an enemy who sought to enslave them, had fought against the weight of history itself to carve out a future. But now, there was nothing left to fight. No war to win, no battles to strategize. The Republic had seen to that. Kalee was suffocating under the weight of the sanctions, and no amount of skill, no mastery of war, could change that. That was when the intergalactic banking clan arrived. San Hill, the clan's moon representative, had watched the war unfold from a distance. It wasn't about morality or justice or taking sides. It was about opportunity. The Kaleesh were desperate, and desperation was a currency the banking clan understood better than any form of credit. They came not with weapons, but with promises. They would lift Kalee from ruin. They would provide food, restore trade, erase the debt that now crushed the planet. They would undo the damage the Republic had inflicted. But nothing in the galaxy was ever free. Kiman Shal listened to their terms. In exchange for their aid, he would serve as an enforcer. The banking clan had many debts to collect, many enemies to remind of their obligations. He was a warrior, after all. What difference did it make who he fought for, as long as his people were saved? He had been a warlord once. Now, he would be something else. He took the offer. The first missions were simple. A pirate fleet refusing to pay its debts was eliminated in a single calculated assault. A corrupt planetary governor who had defaulted on his loans was sent a message, one that ensured no one would dare to repeat his mistake. There was no honor in it, no grand cause, just orders carried out with precision. The banking clan had no interest in glory, only results. And Kiman delivered. But with each mission, the weight of his choices grew heavier. He was no longer leading warriors into battle. He was not fighting for his home, for his ancestors, for the spirit of Kalee. He was a weapon, wielded by those who had no loyalty, no history, no sense of anything beyond profit. He had once been the master of his own destiny. Now he was nothing more than a tool, sharpened by war and wielded by those who saw him as nothing more than an asset to be used. The war had ended, but in its place, something colder had taken hold. He had not saved Kalee. He had only bought time. And soon, the price of that time would become clear. The orders had been given. The banking clan had decided that Kiman Shal was no longer an asset. He was an obstacle. He had served his purpose, carried out their will, and ensured that the debts of those foolish enough to cross them were paid in blood. But he was too strong, too independent. A warrior like him would never remain content as a servant. Eventually, he would turn his gaze toward those who held his people in chains, and the banking clan would not be caught waiting. The plan was simple. A routine transport mission, a faulty navigation system, a catastrophic malfunction mid-flight, no survivors. The official reports would state that an unfortunate accident had claimed the life of the great warlord of Kalee. The banking clan would express regret, send condolences to his people, and move on. They had done this before. It was efficient. His shuttle never reached its destination. The detonation was precise, surgically placed to cripple rather than destroy. Kiman was thrown into a storm of fire and metal, his body torn apart in an instant. The force of the explosion crushed his lungs, shattered his ribs, burned through his flesh. He was still alive when the wreckage crashed onto the barren sands of Kalee, but barely. His limbs were gone, his organs failing. He should have died there, surrounded by the land he had fought for. But death was not his fate. When he awoke, it was not to the sky of his homeworld, but to the cold, sterile glow of a medical facility. Geonosis, a world known for its war machines, its factories, and its connections to something far larger than the banking clan. He was not alone. Count Dooku stood over him, calm, composed, watching as the final remnants of Kiman Shal clung to life. The banking clan had carried out the assassination, but they had not been the architects of it. Dooku had planned this. The Sith had seen in Kiman something greater than a warlord, greater than a mere enforcer. They had seen a weapon, one that could be reforged into something far more powerful than the flesh and bone warrior he had once been. The machines kept him breathing, but barely. His body had been reduced to ruin, his strength taken from him, his ability to fight stripped away. And in that moment, Dooku made his offer. Life in exchange for servitude. The Republic had abandoned him. The Jedi had judged his people unworthy. The banking clan had betrayed him. But the Sith, they promised vengeance, power, a war that would not just restore his honor, but bring entire civilizations to their knees. Kiman Shal had spent his life fighting for Kalee. That life was over. Whatever he became now would serve a far greater war. He did not hesitate. He chose survival. And with that choice, the Warlord of Kalee died. The being who would rise in his place would carry a new name, one that would burn itself into history. There was no waking from this, no return to the world he had known. The pain was different now, not the raw agony of torn flesh or shattered bone, but something deeper, something unnatural. He could not feel his body, yet he knew it was there, or at least what remained of it. The weight of something unfamiliar, something mechanical, had taken its place. His first breath came in a rasping choke, not through lungs of his own, but through machinery that forced air into his body with each shuddering intake. His heart did not beat. Instead, a cold, artificial rhythm pulsed through what little organic tissue remained inside his duranium shell. The medical droids moved around him, adjusting wires, calibrating systems, ensuring that this thing they had created functioned as intended. Kiman Shal no longer existed. He tried to move, and the sound of metal scraping against metal filled the chamber. His limbs, if they could even be called that, responded too quickly, too precisely, as if they belonged to someone else. The fluidity of a living body was gone, replaced with something that obeyed commands without hesitation. But there was no warmth, no feeling, just the calculated movement of a weapon that had once been a man. The reflection in the polished steel of the chamber showed a monstrosity. Gone was the warrior of Kalee, the flesh and blood leader who had once fought for his people. In his place stood a towering machine built for war, designed for destruction. The golden eyes of his past life remained, trapped within a skull-like mask that mocked the warrior he had once been. Rage surged, an instinctive reaction to something that should not exist, something that should never have been allowed to exist. He lashed out, sending the nearest medical droid crashing into the wall, its frame collapsing under the sheer force of the impact. The sound echoed through the chamber, and for a moment, there was silence. Then a voice, calm and deliberate, cut through the chaos. "You are awake." Count Dooku stood at the entrance, hands clasped behind his back, his expression unreadable. There was no concern, no hesitation, only the measured gaze of a man who had orchestrated everything. Grievous turned to face him, the motion far too smooth, far too precise. Every movement felt foreign, unnatural. His voice, when it came, was wrong. "What have you done to me?" The sound was guttural, distorted, no longer his own. Dooku did not answer immediately. He stepped forward, inspecting the final product of the Sith's careful design. "You have been given the strength to achieve what the Republic sought to deny you. The Jedi will fall, the Republic will burn, and you will lead the army that will see it done." The words should have brought satisfaction. They did not. This was not vengeance. This was something else, something far worse. Kiman Shal was gone. Only Grievous remained. The halls of the training chamber were silent, save for the hum of lightsabers and the rhythmic clash of energy against energy. General Grievous stood at the center, his duranium body reflecting the cold, dim glow of the overhead lights. His movements were mechanical, efficient, yet something was missing. He had always been a warrior, but this body was not his own. It responded with a precision that flesh never could, yet lacked the instinct, the fluidity of a true warrior's form, and Count Dooku intended to correct that. Dooku watched from the sidelines, his gaze sharp, calculating. He had transformed warlords before, but this was something new. A mind that once thrived on the battlefield, now bound to a machine built only for war. But war was not enough. Victory required mastery. "You rely too much on brute force," Dooku observed, his tone clipped, unimpressed. "Your body is an advantage, but power without control is wasted." Grievous did not answer. He simply attacked. 4 arms, each wielding a humming blade, moved with the precision of a droid and the ferocity of a warrior. The speed was unnatural, overwhelming, a relentless assault designed to break whatever stood in its way. But Dooku was no ordinary opponent. With the slightest tilt of his wrist, the Sith Lord redirected every strike, his Makashi technique weaving through the storm of attacks as if it were a choreographed dance. The first duel ended as expected. Grievous on the floor, sparks flickering from a severed limb, Dooku standing over him with a blade at his throat. "You are predictable," Dooku said simply, deactivating his saber, "and predictability will get you killed." The second duel lasted longer. The third, longer still. Weeks turned to months, and with each session, Grievous adapted. His mind, once skeptical of the cold efficiency of his new body, began to embrace it. He learned to break the rhythm of his attacks, to control his aggression, to feint and mislead before striking the fatal blow. The Jedi had always relied on form, on order. Dooku taught him to shatter that order. Yet the training was not just physical. The Sith Lord's true art was manipulation, and here he wielded it with the same elegance as his saber. Each session, he reminded Grievous of Kalee's suffering, of the Jedi's failure, of the Republic's betrayal. He did not need to lie. The truth was weapon enough. "Every Jedi you face will believe they are better than you," Dooku told him one evening. "They will call you a monster, a savage. Make them fear that monster. Take from them what they took from you." And then came the first real test. A Jedi prisoner, bound and disarmed, dropped at Grievous's feet. Not a simulation, a real Jedi, one who had fought on Kalee, who had enforced the Republic's sanctions. Dooku gave no command. None was needed. The first lightsaber entered Grievous's collection that night. The Jedi Order had created him. Now, they would learn to fear him. The war had begun, and with it, a new name was spoken across the galaxy. General Grievous. Not a man, not a warrior, but something else. A force that cut through Republic forces with precision and ruthlessness. The Supreme Commander of the Separatist droid army had arrived, and his first campaign would set the tone for what was to come. His unveiling was deliberate, orchestrated to inspire both terror and admiration. The Separatist Council was gathered in a shadowed war room, their holograms flickering around the massive strategic display. The usual figures were present, leaders of the Techno-Union, the Trade Federation, the banking clan. They had all poured resources into this war, but none of them had seen what their investment had created. Grievous entered in silence. His movements were unnatural, calculated yet strangely fluid. The sound of metal joints clicking as he strode forward was deliberate, each step echoing against the Durasteel floor. He was taller than them all, more imposing than any leader in the room. When he spoke, the mechanical rasp of his voice silenced even the most arrogant among them. "You are all here because you wish to break the Republic," he said. "I will see it done." Count Dooku stood beside him, watching, his expression unreadable. To the Council, this was the Supreme Commander they had been promised. To Dooku, this was a weapon, crafted and sharpened for one purpose. The first campaign came swiftly, a Republic outpost on Hypori, a perfect target. The Jedi had underestimated the Separatists' growing strength, and Grievous would be the lesson that taught them fear. There was no warning, no transmission demanding surrender. The attack began without hesitation. Droid legions poured from dropships, wave after wave of battle-hardened units sweeping through the outpost, systematic and relentless. Republic clones fought with discipline, but something was different. Their usual tactics, bottlenecking enemy forces, setting up defensive perimeters, failed. The droids moved with calculated aggression, pressing forward without hesitation, without fear. They had always been programmed for battle. Now, they were led by it. And then he arrived. The Jedi on the battlefield felt it before they saw him. A presence, unnatural yet undeniably real. And when he stepped through the smoke, they understood. 4 lightsabers ignited in unison. Blades of fallen Jedi, turned against their own. Grievous did not fight like a droid. He did not fight like a Jedi. He fought like something new. Every strike was overwhelming, every movement a calculated distortion of traditional combat. Jedi who had trained for decades fell in moments. Their defenses, once unshakable, were shattered. By the time the last transmission from Hypori was received, the Republic knew this was not just another droid commander. A warrior had returned, but he was no longer fighting for his people. Grievous did not need the Force to be feared. He understood something that many Jedi never did. Fear itself is a weapon. A lightsaber was a tool. A blaster was effective at a distance, but fear crippled enemies before a battle even began. It forced hesitation, paralyzed decision-making, and shattered morale before a single strike was made. Grievous was not just a warrior. He was a symbol, an unstoppable force that turned war itself into terror. The strategy was deliberate. Everything about his presence was designed to instill fear. His towering frame, standing over 7 feet tall, loomed over his enemies. The skull-like mask, inspired by the bone armor of his people, was a deliberate choice. The echoes of his cybernetic body, metallic joints clicking, claws scraping against the ground, created a rhythm that set nerves on edge long before he was even seen. And then there was the cough. At first, it was an unintended side effect of his cybernetic reconstruction. His lungs, the few organic parts that remained, had been scorched in the process, leaving his breathing harsh and labored. But rather than mask it, he let it remain. The sound of his ragged breathing became a warning, a death rattle that preceded him into battle. Jedi survivors of past encounters would recount it in hushed whispers, the cough, then the slaughter. Fear was not just a byproduct of his battles. It was the strategy itself. Grievous rarely struck without a purpose. Surprise attacks were executed not just for efficiency, but to unsettle. He ensured that his assaults left just enough survivors to tell the story. His battles were often over long before the first blow was struck, because he had already won in the minds of his enemies. And there was the trophy collection. Every Jedi who fell to his blade left behind something, a weapon, a symbol, a piece of their legacy. Their lightsabers were not discarded, nor were they destroyed. They were taken. Each one was added to his collection, displayed openly, used against the Jedi who still remained. To the Jedi Order, a lightsaber was not just a weapon, It was an extension of their very being. To see one in the hands of an enemy, wielded without honor, was devastating. Grievous did not take them for vanity. He took them to break his enemies before they even fought him. When he ignited his blades, it was never just one or two. It was four stolen legacies, proof of the Jedi who had already fallen. Every duel began with a silent message: "You will be next." Republic commanders began to dread reports of his movements. Jedi Knights spoke of him in hushed tones, a Jedi killer who had no connection to the Force, yet tore through their ranks with unnatural precision. The Order had faced Sith before. They had faced wars, but they had never faced this. Grievous was more than a commander, more than a warrior. He was a nightmare given form. The battlefield of Hypori was a graveyard long before the final body fell. It began with silence, the kind that settles just before something terrible. The Republic had landed, confident in their numbers, their training, their cause. What they faced was something else entirely. The ambush was not immediate. Grievous let the fear build first. The Jedi and their clone forces found themselves surrounded, trapped within the wreckage of their own shattered ships. The droids came in waves, relentless, pressing the attack with surgical precision. The Jedi, led by some of the Order's finest, fought with everything they had, but the enemy was adapting. The Separatists had spent months refining their tactics. Grievous had studied the Jedi in ways no enemy had before. And then he entered the battlefield. A towering figure stepping through the smoke, lightsabers igniting in unison. 4 blades spinning in a blinding flurry of motion. He moved with a precision that was unnatural, an efficiency that defied even the most seasoned Jedi's expectations. The first strike was instant. One Jedi down, then another. His movements were overwhelming. No wasted energy, no unnecessary motion. His extra limbs let him attack from angles no Jedi had ever prepared for. Against a Sith, they could anticipate aggression fueled by the Force. Against Grievous, there was no emotion to read, no presence to predict. Just metal, speed, and death. Kakruk, a seasoned warrior, barely survived the first onslaught. His instincts, honed over years of training, were useless here. Jedi who had fought Sith Lords and Separatist generals found themselves on the defensive, scrambling. It was not a duel. It was a slaughter. Shakti, one of the most experienced Jedi on the field, attempted to rally the survivors, calling for coordination, for unity. But Grievous was too fast, too aggressive. His strategy was not just about combat, it was about breaking them. He spoke to them as he killed, mocking them, not with rage, not with hatred, with cold amusement. Jedi are warriors, yes? He would show them what that meant. The survivors would never forget the sound of his claws scraping against the durasteel floor, nor the unmistakable mechanical rasp of his breathing, the cough that preceded the slaughter. Ki Adi Mundi, a veteran of countless battles, had never faced anything like this. The Jedi had always believed themselves to be the pinnacle of combatants, defenders of the Republic, trained in lightsaber combat for generations. Hypori shattered that belief. For the first time, they faced an enemy who was not Sith, not a dark side Force user, but something entirely different. A creation of war, built for one purpose: killing Jedi. When the survivors finally escaped, they carried more than just injuries. They carried fear. Fear that the Republic, that the Jedi Order itself, had no answer for General Grievous. For the Jedi, combat was a discipline, something refined, taught in temples, perfected over centuries. For Grievous, it was a hunt, and the Jedi were nothing more than prey. After Hypori, the Republic scrambled to adjust. The Jedi Order, already strained by the war, could not ignore what had just happened. This was not a rogue Sith Lord, not some warlord with a grudge. This was something entirely new, a warrior engineered for the sole purpose of slaughtering them. And yet, even as the Jedi strategized, even as they tried to understand their new adversary, Grievous was already moving on to the next hunt. His tactics became deliberate, methodical. He no longer fought battles, he staged them. The first wave would always be the droids, a relentless, overwhelming force designed to isolate Jedi from their clone troopers. Once they were separated, once their forces had been broken apart, Grievous would enter the battlefield himself. He fought like no one else. There was no honor, no measured exchange of skill. He did not engage in drawn-out duels unless it served a purpose. If a Jedi was skilled, Grievous would prolong the fight, not for challenge, but to study them, to learn the weaknesses of their form, to understand their movements. Every battle added to his knowledge. Every Jedi he cut down made the next one easier to kill. The horror of it all was not just the slaughter, it was the precision. A Jedi's greatest weapon was not their lightsaber. It was their ability to predict, to sense, to anticipate. The Force guided them, giving them a level of awareness unmatched by any ordinary opponent. But Grievous was unreadable. There was no Force signature, no emotion to follow, no darkness to anticipate, just metal, motion, and death. He understood something no other enemy had before. Fear had to be nurtured. A massacre was effective, but a survivor was worth far more. He began to let them live. Not out of mercy, out of strategy. Jedi who escaped his wrath became his heralds. They returned to the Order with terror in their eyes. They told stories of a monster with 4 blades, a machine that fought with the knowledge of a warrior, but the efficiency of a droid. These reports spread faster than any Republic intelligence briefing ever could. The first to fall under his blade were names that, before the war, would have been legends. Darkman Barrick, Nistamul, Jamar, Tar Seer. Jedi Masters, once thought invincible, reduced to casualties in Grievous's campaign of terror. Every fallen Jedi meant another lightsaber for his collection, another reminder that the Jedi were not untouchable. The war was changing. The Republic still fought for victory. The Jedi were now fighting for survival. Grievous had turned the battlefield into something new, a hunting ground. And the Jedi? They had become prey. The invisible hand did not simply exist as a tool of war. It was Grievous's throne, his fortress, his kingdom, a vessel that brought death wherever it traveled, a looming shadow over battlefields across the galaxy. The very name struck dread into Republic forces, a reminder that their greatest enemy could appear at any moment, unleash destruction, and disappear into hyperspace before they had even begun to comprehend what had happened. Built by the Trade Federation, the Invisible Hand was originally a Lucrehulk-class battleship, one of the largest capital ships in the Separatist fleet. But under Grievous's command, it had been transformed into something far worse. Reinforced armor, advanced hyperdrive capabilities, and a command structure designed around the needs of its master. It was not a fleet carrier meant to ferry droids. It was a precision weapon, and its entire existence revolved around one purpose: domination. Inside its halls, a different kind of terror awaited. For the Jedi, capture meant something worse than death. The Invisible Hand did not operate under the rules of war. It did not house prisoners. It held trophies. Deep within its corridors, Grievous kept his collection, dozens of lightsabers displayed as relics of his victories. Each one had belonged to a Jedi who had once stood against him. Each one told a story of a life cut short, The walls of his personal chamber were lined with them, humming with the residual energy of their former wielders. Then there were the interrogation chambers. For clone troopers, the end was swift. A blade through the chest, a broken neck, a crushed skull beneath the weight of durasteel talons. But for Jedi, Grievous had questions, and when he wanted answers, he had methods. His Magna Guards, relentless and unfeeling, carried out his will, subjecting captured Jedi to unspeakable fates. Not out of cruelty, but efficiency. There was always something to learn, and if a Jedi was too stubborn, too defiant, then there was another lesson to be taught, that even the greatest warriors of the Republic could break. The invisible hand was not just a warship. It was a graveyard that floated through the void, leaving destruction in its wake. With every battle, with every campaign, the ship became a growing monument to the war. The halls stank of oil and charred metal. The hangars, once pristine, were now littered with the remains of ships torn apart in boarding actions. There was no peace within its walls, only the constant sound of marching droids, the hum of hyperspace drives, and the echo of Grievous's mechanical breathing. The Republic knew that wherever the invisible hand appeared, death followed. Entire fleets scrambled at the mere sight of it. And yet, as the war continued, as planets burned and soldiers fell, the ship's halls never felt empty. Because there was always another Jedi to hunt, another trophy to add, another war to wage. Grievous had always seen himself as a warrior, a leader forged in battle, a symbol of strength. But strength alone was not enough, not in this war. Dooku had made that clear from the beginning. At first, the Sith Lord had been a mentor, a teacher who had refined Grievous's natural instincts into something far deadlier. Under his training, the Kalee Warlord had become a master of lightsaber combat, a force that even Jedi masters hesitated to face. But the relationship between them had never been one of mutual respect. Dooku did not view Grievous as an equal. He saw a weapon, a tool to be wielded. The tension between them had always simmered beneath the surface. Grievous may have been a cyborg, but he was not blind. He knew when he was being used. Dooku spoke of honor, of the great war against the corrupt Republic, of vengeance against the Jedi for their betrayal. And yet, his orders were never about Kalee. They were about expanding Separatist control, securing Sith ambitions, furthering a plan that Grievous had never been made privy to. The more battles he fought, the more worlds he crushed beneath his heel, the clearer the truth became. This was not his war, but what choice did he have? Dooku had given him this body, this life. The intergalactic banking clan still controlled the flow of resources to Kalee, ensuring its survival while Grievous waged war in the stars. If he defied the Count, if he refused to follow orders, what would happen to his people? Would the Sith still uphold their promises? Or would Kalee simply become another casualty, another forgotten world left to rot? Even as he questioned his purpose, Dooku ensured his loyalty remained intact. Manipulation was the Sith Lord's greatest weapon. Every encounter between them followed the same pattern. Praise when it was needed, criticism when it was useful, promises of greater power when Grievous's doubts grew too strong, and, when necessary, humiliation. Dooku enjoyed reminding him of what he was, a creation of the Sith, a warrior who had been reforged through their vision. The training sessions were proof enough. Whenever Grievous grew too confident, too certain of his superiority, the Count would put him in his place. A flick of a wrist, a burst of lightning, a demonstration of power that Grievous could never possess. The message was always the same: you are strong, but you are not Sith. He hated the way Dooku spoke down to him. hated the way his orders always served some deeper game. But hatred was fuel. If Grievous could not break free, he would use it. Every victory, every Jedi slain, every Republic ship reduced to wreckage, each one was a step closer to his own revenge. But whose revenge was he fighting for? Kalee had become an afterthought, a name that lingered in his mind but never reached the battlefield. This was a war he had been pulled into, a war he could not escape. And somewhere in the shadows, Dooku was pulling the strings. Grievous had fought in countless battles, but this was different. Coruscant was the heart of the Republic, the center of everything the Jedi and the Senate held sacred. To strike here was to prove that nowhere was safe, no world was beyond his reach, and no symbol of power was untouchable. The attack was planned with precision. Separatist fleets emerged from hyperspace, breaking through the planetary defenses before Coruscant's military could fully react. Turbo lasers painted the skyline with fire, warships descended through the clouds, and the Separatist droid armies flooded the lower districts, spreading chaos across the Ecumenopolis. While the Republic scrambled to counter the invasion, Grievous led the most important part of the operation. His target was the Senate district, where Chancellor Palpatine had been secured under the Jedi's protection. The kidnapping of the Supreme Chancellor was not just a tactical move, it was psychological warfare at its peak. The Republic would be thrown into disarray. Their leader, their symbol of unity, ripped from the very heart of their defenses. Grievous relished the opportunity. This was the culmination of everything he had been trained for. No more subtlety, no more quiet terror. This was a statement, one that would be heard across the galaxy. But something was wrong. The resistance was stronger than anticipated. Jedi, clone troopers, and Coruscant's elite security forces fought back with relentless ferocity. The deeper Grievous pushed into the Chancellor's secure tower, the more the battle turned from overwhelming assault to desperate struggle. His droids were efficient, but they lacked instinct. Against well-trained Jedi, they were nothing more than blaster fodder. He moved through the corridors like a storm of metal and fury. Lightsabers flashed in his hands, deflecting blaster bolts, cutting down anything in his way. The Jedi who stood between him and his target fought bravely, but bravery was never enough. Finally, he reached Palpatine. The Supreme Chancellor stood there, calm, almost amused. It unsettled Grievous in a way he did not yet understand. Why was he not afraid? He had no time to dwell on the thought. Jedi reinforcements were closing in. Skywalker and Kenobi were on their way. The window for escape was closing, and Grievous would not be denied his victory. Grabbing the Chancellor, he retreated to his flagship, the Invisible Hand, as Republic forces tried to intercept his escape. The battle raged through the upper atmosphere, ships tearing each other apart as Grievous's vessel climbed toward open space. But as the Jedi pursued him onto the bridge of his own ship, things took a turn he had not expected. Kenobi was as relentless as ever. Skywalker was something else entirely. The duel aboard the Invisible Hand forced Grievous onto the defensive in ways he had never been before. Skywalker's strength was unnatural, fueled by something raw and untamed. Kenobi's precision kept him on edge. For the first time, the cracks in his armor were showing. He escaped, barely. But Coruscant had revealed something that disturbed him. For all his power, for all his victories, he was not invincible. And worse still, he had been played. Grievous had fought Jedi before. He had studied their techniques, torn apart their defenses, and turned their weapons into trophies. He knew their arrogance, their weaknesses, their misplaced confidence. But this time, he had underestimated his opponent. Mace Windu was not like the others. The battle had erupted in the chaos following the invasion of Coruscant. Grievous was retreating, but the Jedi were relentless. Republic forces had regrouped faster than expected, and the Separatists were losing their grip on the battle. What had begun as a daring strike to shatter the Republic's morale was unraveling into something more dangerous. Grievous himself had become a hunted target. Windu was waiting. When their paths finally crossed, there was no hesitation, no wasted words. Grievous lunged forward, his mechanical body twisting into motion, sabers igniting in a deadly blur. But Windu was already there, his amethyst blade intercepting the attack with perfect control. The Kalee general had fought many Jedi, but this felt different. Windu was precise, measured, never leaving an opening. His mastery of Varpad, a style that thrived on aggression, feeding off the darkness of his enemies, turned Grievous's own brutality against him. Every attack, every furious strike was absorbed, redirected, and returned with devastating force. For the first time, Grievous felt cornered. He had been trained to fight Jedi, but Windu wasn't just a Jedi. He was a master of combat in its purest form. The general's speed, his multiple arms, his unpredictable angles, it was all accounted for, neutralized and dismantled piece by piece. Then came the moment that changed everything. Grievous moved to disengage, his instincts warning him that this fight was slipping out of his control. But Windu was faster. Before the general could retreat, a hand shot forward, not with a blade, not with a strike, with the Force. Grievous had always mocked the Jedi's reliance on their mysticism, their dependence on something he could neither see nor wield. But he understood it now. It wasn't magic. It was power. The invisible hand of Windu's will gripped Grievous's chest plate like a vice, and then it crushed. Pain. Raw, excruciating pain. Grievous's cybernetic body had given him a kind of invincibility, but his organs, what remained of his flesh, were still vulnerable. The Jedi Master's force crush collapsed his ribcage, crushed his lungs, and reduced him to a gasping, choking shell of what he had been moments before. He barely escaped. The battle had not just been lost. Something deeper had been taken from him. His body, already stolen from him once, was failing. Every breath from that moment forward would be agony. Every movement would be slower, more labored. The terrifying speed and fluidity that had once made him an unstoppable force in battle, it was gone. And with it, so was the illusion of his own invincibility. Grievous had always understood war. He knew how battles were won, how armies moved, how empires rose and fell. But he had never considered that he might be nothing more than a tool. Not until it was too late. The invasion of Coruscant should have been a turning point. It had been a success, and yet the Separatists were losing. No matter how many victories they claimed, the Republic refused to collapse. It was as if the war had been designed to stretch endlessly, a game played by unseen hands. And those hands did not belong to Count Dooku. They belonged to Darth Sidious. At first the signs were subtle. Orders that made little sense, movements that led to unnecessary losses, and resources that should have been allocated differently. Dooku assured him that strategy required sacrifices, but something felt wrong. Grievous was not a strategist in name alone. He saw the patterns forming. The Separatists were being positioned to lose. Palpatine, the Republic's supposed leader, had been taken prisoner, yet he was miraculously recovered. The Jedi were still breathing, and the war, despite every crushing blow, refused to end. Then came the most damning revelation of all. Dooku was dead. Obi-Wan Kenobi and Anakin Skywalker had stormed his flagship. The battle had been fierce, but in the end, Skywalker had executed the Sith Lord on Palpatine's command. That was the moment Grievous understood. Dooku had been expendable, and if Dooku was expendable, then so was he. He replayed every conversation with the Sith Lord, every moment of training, every battle waged in the name of the Separatist cause. It had always been a means to an end. Dooku had never intended for the Separatists to win. Grievous had spent years slaughtering Jedi, believing himself the sword that would cut the Republic's throat. But there was no final victory waiting for him. Palpatine's plan had always been about Skywalker. The war existed to forge him into something darker. The Republic and the Separatists, all of it had been a carefully orchestrated illusion, a way to dismantle the Jedi while creating the conditions for the Sith to rule. Grievous was not meant to survive the war. Paranoia crept into his circuits. Had Dooku known? Had he lied to him from the start? Or had the Sith Lord also been deceived, believing he held power when in reality he had been a pawn just like Grievous? It no longer mattered. The Separatists had lost their leader, and the Republic was advancing. His position was weaker than ever. The Jedi would hunt him down, the clones would show no mercy, and the Sith, the very ones who had transformed him, had already discarded him. For the first time since becoming General Grievous, he felt something that had been buried beneath rage, hatred, and vengeance. Doubt. Grievous had fought on 100 worlds. He had crushed fleets, slaughtered Jedi, and burned cities to the ground. But this time, something was different. This was not another battle. This was the end. Utapau was a planet of deep sinkholes, a labyrinthine world where secrecy thrived. It was the perfect place for the last remnants of the Separatists to regroup, to mount a desperate stand against the inevitable. But deep down, Grievous knew there would be no regrouping, no reinforcements, no path to victory. The war was already lost. He stood on the high command platform of Pao City, looking down as the Separatist leaders cowered behind him. They were politicians, not warriors. And now, they finally understood what he had always known. War had no mercy. A transmission came through. The reports were dire. Republic forces had arrived. Not just clones, a Jedi, and not just any Jedi, Obi-Wan Kenobi. Grievous flexed his talons against the cold metal of his perch. He remembered Kenobi from past encounters, a warrior, but measured, precise, dangerous. This would not be a swift kill. Below, Republic gunships descended into the vast caverns, unleashing legions of clone troopers. The people of Utapau, unwilling hosts in this war, could only watch as the city became a battlefield. Grievous did not hesitate. He activated the signal for his droid armies to deploy, the mechanical behemoths clanking into formation, their blasters primed. And then he saw him. Kenobi had arrived on the back of a Varactyl, riding through enemy fire as if it were nothing. He moved through the chaos with effortless grace, slicing down battle droids like they were nothing more than insects. Grievous sneered. The Jedi always fought with such arrogance, as if the Force itself granted them the right to exist above all others. He would remind Kenobi of the truth. Grievous stepped forward, his cloak billowing as he made his presence known. Kenobi had not come for diplomacy. He had come for a reckoning. The Jedi dismounted, standing firm as dust and debris swirled around them. Grievous studied him, this so-called warrior of peace, who had become one of the Republic's most efficient killers. There were no words exchanged. There was no need. They both understood. This was the last battle. Grievous let his cloak fall to the ground, revealing the weapons that had made him infamous. 4 arms extended, and with them, 4 stolen lightsabers ignited. The clash was immediate. Kenobi moved with skill, but Grievous attacked like a storm. Sparks flew, metal screamed against plasma. The general did not fight like a Jedi, nor like a Sith. He fought like something else entirely, something that was never meant to exist. A warrior bound in steel, a ghost of war. And on Utapau, the ghost would fight until his final breath. The battle raged across the catacombs of Utapau, but in the heart of it, only two figures mattered. Kenobi moved like a master of war, controlled, efficient, relentless. Grievous countered with raw brutality, his four blades striking from impossible angles. Each clash sent bursts of energy crackling through the air. The tunnels trembled beneath the weight of their conflict. But Kenobi was not like the others. He did not fear the monster before him. He had faced Grievous before, seen the carnage he left in his wake, and now he had come to end it. Grievous struck with all the precision that had made him infamous. A flurry of slashes designed to overwhelm, to dismantle, to destroy. Kenobi evaded narrowly, countering where he could, looking for an opening. The general's laughter echoed through the cavern, a voice distorted by metal, by years of rage. "You are a fool, Kenobi." His yellow eyes burned with hatred. "Your order is doomed. Your republic is already dying." Kenobi did not respond. He knew words would not end this. Instead, he moved. A sudden strike, a clean cut. One of Grievous's arms fell, severed, sparking on the ground. Grievous recoiled, rage flashing through him. He lunged forward, but Kenobi's blade found its mark again. Another limb lost, then another. The general stumbled back, now reduced to his true form. A hunted thing, wounded and desperate. His eyes darted around, searching for escape. Kenobi advanced, calm, unwavering. Grievous refused to fall. He threw himself at the Jedi, claws scraping against stone, his remaining arm striking wildly. Kenobi parried each attack, his technique surgical, deliberate. But then, the mistake. Grievous lunged, overextending. Kenobi seized the moment, gripping his enemy's chest plate. With all his strength, he pried it open, and there it was, the heart, the last piece of the warrior he had once been. Grievous staggered, for the first time truly vulnerable. His breath came in ragged, unnatural gasps. His body, a machine of war, was finally failing him. Kenobi did not hesitate. The blaster, a single shot to the exposed organ, then another, and another. The flames ignited within him. Grievous convulsed, his metal frame writhing as the fire consumed him from the inside. The mechanical lungs that had powered his monstrous existence failed him. He fell. The Warlord, the Hunter, the Nightmare. Kenobi watched as Grievous collapsed, the fire burning until only a husk remained. His reign of terror was over. And yet, there was no victory here. The Clone Wars would not end with this battle. The Republic was not safe. Kenobi had struck down a monster, but in the shadows, greater evils waited. Grievous was dead. But his death was only the beginning of the Republic's fall. The fires of Utapau smoldered, the echoes of battle fading into silence. The Warlord's corpse lay twisted among the wreckage, his mechanical frame blackened and lifeless. General Grievous was no more, but his death did not bring an end to the war. It only paved the way for something far worse. Back on Coruscant, the news spread quickly. The Republic declared it a decisive victory, a turning point in the Clone Wars. Official reports painted Grievous as the final threat to stability, the last great monster standing between the Republic and peace. They did not speak of what he had once been. There was no mention of the warrior from Kalee, no acknowledgement of the tragedy that had shaped him. His story was stripped away, reduced to propaganda. In the eyes of the Republic, he had never been a man, only a machine programmed to kill. The Jedi Council received the reports with a mix of relief and unease. Kenobi's victory had removed one of the Separatists' most dangerous leaders, but something felt off. The war was still raging, and despite Grievous's death, it showed no signs of ending. For years, Jedi had fallen at his hands. Now, the nightmare was gone, yet the galaxy did not feel any safer. Among the Separatists, the loss was catastrophic. Grievous had been more than a military leader. He had been their shield, their enforcer. Without him, their forces were exposed, leaderless. His death sent a ripple through their ranks, a growing sense of panic. They did not know it yet, but the end was coming. Count Dooku was already dead. Now Grievous had fallen. The Separatist Council began to realize the truth. They had no future. But perhaps the most chilling reaction came from the one who had orchestrated it all. Darth Sidious. Grievous had served his purpose. He had been a tool, nothing more. A blade sharpened and wielded to cut down the Republic's enemies. But like all tools, he was discarded when he was no longer needed. Palpatine did not mourn him. If anything, his death was a necessity, because now, with Grievous gone, the stage was set for the next phase of the plan. Order 66. The Republic had its victory, the Jedi had their temporary peace, and the Separatists had their despair. But in the shadows, the Sith smiled. Grievous had been a terror, but he was never the real villain, and his death had only brought the Republic closer to the abyss. Even in death, he haunted them. General Grievous had been a force unlike anything the Jedi had faced. The Sith had always been their greatest enemy, but Grievous was something different. He had no connection to the Force, no place in their ancient struggles of balance and darkness. He had been something worse, a predator. Jedi had spent generations honing their skills, believing that the Force was their greatest ally. They had fought Sith Lords, Dark Acolytes and Warlords, always relying on their ability to anticipate, to sense, to react. But Grievous changed that. He had no presence in the Force, no signature that could be felt. To a Jedi, that was unnatural. They could sense rage in a Sith, doubt in a fellow knight, even the tremors of fate. But against Grievous, there was only emptiness. The few who survived an encounter with him spoke in hushed voices. They called him a demon, a hunter of Jedi. His movements were erratic, unpredictable, no fatigue, no hesitation, no fear. The Force could not warn them of where his attacks would come from, because he did not think like a duelist. He fought like a killer. Some called it luck when they survived. Others knew it was by design. He let survivors go, knowing they would spread the legend. The Jedi who lived through Hypori never forgot. They had watched him slaughter their friends, dissecting them like prey. They had seen the unnatural way he moved, the sheer ferocity of his attacks. And they had heard the voice, a guttural, rasping mockery of what once was a warrior's battle cry. Even the greatest Jedi were not immune to his terror. Mace Windu had crushed him, yet even that did not bring relief, because Windu had seen something the others had not. Grievous was a symptom of something far worse. He had not been the true enemy, merely a weapon in the hands of the Sith. By the time the Republic declared his death a victory, the Jedi Order was already crumbling. Grievous had burned through their ranks, leaving them vulnerable. The best warriors of the Order had been picked off, one by one. The ones who remained were spread thin, weary, unprepared. Then came Order 66. The Jedi were already weakened. They had been at war for too long, fighting an enemy they never understood, and in the end, they never saw the real threat, until it was too late. Grievous had been a monster, a nightmare, a terror the Jedi would speak of for generations. But his true purpose had never been to win. It had been to soften them. Long before he was General Grievous, before he was a name whispered in fear across the galaxy, he was a Kalee warrior. His name had been Kiman Sheal, and he had fought for his people, not for conquest, not for power, but because survival had been the only choice. And yet, when his war ended, Kalee suffered more than ever. For all his victories, for every battle he won, his homeworld was still burning. The Republic had left Kalee to rot. After siding with the Yamri, the insectoid invaders who had started the war, the Republic had branded the Kalee as aggressors. Sanctions were imposed, starvation followed. Entire cities crumbled into dust while the Jedi stood by, enforcing a punishment they did not understand. The intergalactic banking clan had offered a way out. They had given Sheal the power to fight again. But power always came with a price. The cost was his identity. They had transformed him into something else, stripped him of his flesh, of his name, of his past. He had become their enforcer, their weapon. He had taken the new name they gave him, Grievous, because that was all that was left of him. And in the years that followed, Kalee was forgotten. The people he had once fought for were reduced to scavengers on their own world. The Republic did nothing. The Separatists, whom he led into battle, never turned their resources towards saving Kalee. Even Count Dooku, who had whispered promises of vengeance, had never intended to restore his home. Grievous had been their leader, their greatest warrior, and he had abandoned them. Perhaps he had told himself it was temporary, that when the war was won, he would return. But war never truly ends, and those who become weapons never get to go home. By the time he fell on Utapau, Kalee was nothing more than a footnote in the galaxy's history. The Republic was gone, replaced by the Empire. The Jedi he had once hated were being hunted to extinction, and Kalee? It was still suffering. No armies came to save it. No Sith Lords offered alliances. No banners were raised in his honor. Kiman Sheal had once fought for Kalee. General Grievous had died for a war that was never his. From the moment Grievous took his first breath as a cyborg, his fate had already been decided. The war he fought in, the power he wielded, the hatred that burned within him, all of it had been orchestrated by a master who never intended for him to survive. Darth Sidious. The Sith Lord had always been in control, long before Count Dooku had ever found Sheal, long before the war between the Separatists and the Republic had begun. Every battle, every move on the galactic chessboard had been part of a grand design, one that did not include Grievous. He had never been anything more than a tool. The truth was that Grievous was created for a singular purpose, to be the ultimate test for the Jedi, the terror that would weaken their ranks before their final extermination. Sidious needed them desperate, broken, and stretched thin across the war. Grievous was the weapon that made them bleed. But tools are discarded when they are no longer useful. He had been set up to fail. Sidious never planned for him to win the Clone Wars. There was no future where Grievous emerged victorious, where the Separatists ruled the galaxy with him at their head. The very war he had thrown himself into was a carefully crafted illusion, a means to an end that had nothing to do with the freedom of Kalee or the revenge he had long sought. Dooku knew it. The moment Sidious ordered him to train Grievous, Dooku understood what this meant. Grievous was never meant to be an equal, only a weapon to wield. His loyalty to the Sith was not a choice. It had been engineered. The banking clan ensured his servitude. Dooku shaped his rage. Sidious guided his destruction. And when the time came, Sidious gave the order for his death. The Clone Wars had run its course. Order 66 was prepared, the final betrayal set in motion. But before that, one loose end had to be tied up. On Utapau, there was no one left to save him. The moment Grievous lost to Kenobi, Sidious no longer needed to pretend. There was no hidden rescue, no backup plan. The war was ending, and Grievous was no longer required. His death was not a tragedy, it was a design. And the most devastating part, he never even realized it. The Clone Wars ended, but Grievous's influence did not. His tactics, his ruthlessness, and the fear he instilled in the Jedi left an imprint on galactic warfare that stretched far beyond his death. The Separatists were defeated, their leaders executed, and their war machines repurposed, yet the echoes of Grievous's campaigns endured. His methods had reshaped the battlefield in ways the Republic had never encountered before, forcing an evolution in military doctrine that did not simply vanish with his demise. The Empire did not discard everything from the Separatists. In fact, many of its most brutal strategies were modeled after the very campaigns that Grievous had led. Palpatine might have eliminated him, but he did not erase his methods. He saw the value in what Grievous had achieved, how he had commanded entire fleets, crushed opposition with ruthless precision, and weaponized fear as effectively as any blaster. These were not failures. These were lessons. Terror had always been one of Grievous's most effective weapons. He did not simply defeat his enemies, he dismantled them, breaking their will before he destroyed their bodies. He turned warfare into psychological horror, reducing his enemies to prey before the battle had even begun. His slaughter of Jedi on Hypori was not just about victory, it was about spectacle. The few who survived were meant to carry the terror of that moment back to the Order, a chilling reminder of what awaited them. This philosophy found its way into the Galactic Empire's core. Palpatine ruled through fear, the same way Grievous had fought. The Emperor's vast war machine, from planetary bombardments to brutal suppression of rebellion, mirrored the Separatist general's belief in overwhelming force and spectacle. Make them afraid, and they will not resist. Total war had been another principle Grievous refined and wielded without hesitation. If a planet opposed him, he burned it. If an enemy resisted, he crushed them. The idea of mercy was nothing more than a liability. He had learned this lesson during the Huk War and applied it on a galactic scale. He had no patience for the Republic's politics or the Jedi's ethics. Victory was the only objective, and it had to be absolute. The Empire adopted this same approach. Entire worlds were destroyed at the first sign of defiance. The destruction of Alderaan, the mass execution of civilians, the brutality of stormtroopers, these were all echoes of a doctrine Grievous had refined during the Clone Wars. The Jedi may have seen him as a barbarian, but the Empire saw the brutal efficiency in his methods. His war had proven that terror could be just as effective as force, that control was not about winning hearts and minds, it was about making defiance unthinkable. Beyond his tactics, Grievous embodied the next stage of war, the fusion of flesh and machine. No being symbolized this transition better than him. He had turned himself into a living weapon, not out of ambition, but out of necessity. The war had demanded it, and in doing so, he became the ultimate fusion of biology and cold, calculated strategy. His cybernetic enhancements made him something beyond Kalee, something beyond organic limits. He could fight for hours without fatigue, withstand wounds that would kill any living being, and strike with inhuman precision. The Empire learned from this. The rise of mechanical war machines, AT-ATs, Star Destroyers, the Death Star, was not a coincidence. Palpatine had seen firsthand how effective it was to strip emotion from battle, to remove the limitations of organic troops. He expanded on what Grievous had already demonstrated. A war fought by machines was a war that did not require mercy. The Empire sought to replicate this in its own forces, replacing human weaknesses with mechanical superiority. The droid armies of the Separatists had been dismantled, but their lessons remained. The cold precision of the Empire's military, from the faceless stormtroopers to the overwhelming might of its fleets, owed much to the path Grievous had carved. Even his presence haunted the Imperial military. While the Emperor would never acknowledge it, there were officers who studied Grievous's campaigns as a model for efficient warfare. His ability to outmaneuver Jedi, his effectiveness in sieges, his ruthless pursuit of victory, they were all lessons that Imperial commanders integrated into their own doctrines. His tactics in planetary assaults, his ability to stretch enemy forces thin, his use of rapid, unpredictable strikes, these became foundations of Imperial strategy. He had forced the Republic to abandon traditional warfare, and the Empire did not forget the necessity of adaptation. Yet for all his influence, his name faded from memory. His legacy was not preserved through statues or historical accounts, but through the evolution of war itself. His brutality became a foundation. His tactics lived on, even in a galaxy that no longer spoke his name. He had never fought for the Sith, but their empire carried his lessons forward. The Republic had despised him, but its successor built upon his methods. His enemies had wanted to destroy him, yet they had become reflections of the very war he had waged. In many ways, the war Grievous had fought did not end with his death. It was reshaped, repurposed, and evolved under the Empire. The tools he had once wielded against the Jedi were now turned against the rebellion. The same terror that had once stalked Republic forces now loomed over insurgents. The same doctrine of absolute dominance continued, refined and sharpened. His influence did not die with him. It became the foundation of a new era of galactic war. But he did not live to see any of it. His name was erased, his people abandoned, his victories unclaimed. The Republic he had fought against was gone, replaced by something even darker, something that had used him, discarded him, and stolen his legacy without a second thought. The war had ended, but the machine of death he had helped create never stopped moving. It had only changed hands. Grievous was not just a warrior. He was an experiment, a prototype of a new kind of combatant, a being stripped of weakness, rebuilt for destruction, designed to eliminate Jedi with brutal efficiency. His body was more than an instrument of war. It was a glimpse into the future of battle. The technology that had transformed him was neither Sith sorcery nor standard Separatist engineering. It was something far more deliberate. Every modification, every enhancement was chosen with purpose. His reflexes were sharpened to react faster than any organic being could. His frame was armored to withstand attacks that would incapacitate lesser warriors. He had become something beyond a soldier, a mechanical apex predator. The galaxy took notice. He was proof that biology could be surpassed, that warriors no longer needed to be constrained by the weaknesses of their own species. The lessons drawn from his transformation would influence everything from cybernetic prosthetics to the evolution of battle droids and enhanced soldiers. Before Grievous, cybernetic enhancements were mostly a tool of necessity, replacements for lost limbs, aids for aging bodies. After him, they became a path to power. The Empire, the Sith, and even independent warlords began experimenting with ways to create soldiers who were less organic, less fragile. Dark Troopers, a product of the same philosophy that had built Grievous. The Empire's experiments in mechanical warfare sought to replace living soldiers with superior, cybernetically enhanced units. The project ultimately produced terrifying results. Battle-ready warriors who were faster, stronger, and immune to pain. Darth Vader, a grim reflection of what Grievous had been. While Vader was bound by Sith sorcery and life support systems, his armor and augmentations shared a similar purpose, to turn him into something beyond human. His reliance on cybernetics, his sheer physical presence, even his mechanical breathing were reminiscent of the supreme commander of the Separatist army. He was, in a way, the Empire's own Grievous, perfected through the dark side. But while Grievous was a testament to the power of cybernetic warfare, he was also a warning. His body had made him formidable, but at a cost that no machine could measure. The mind inside the metal was still organic, still haunted by pain, rage, and loss. His modifications had taken away his ability to feel anything but war. No taste, no scent, no sense of touch beyond the killing force of his metal limbs. From the Empire's relentless pursuit of mechanical soldiers to the rise of Sith experiments in cybernetics, Grievous's legacy continued. He had proven that warriors could be rebuilt, but whether they could remain whole was another matter entirely. Grievous is remembered as a monster, a warlord without remorse, a murderer of Jedi, a butcher whose mechanical body carried out countless atrocities across the galaxy. His name is spoken with a mixture of fear and disgust, his existence written off as a cautionary tale of brutality unchecked. But how many truly know his story? How many understand that before the war, before the cybernetics, before the rage, he was a man? Was he a villain or a victim? This is the question that lingers, one that history often avoids answering. It is easier to reduce him to a specter of war, to pretend that he was always a terror in the dark. But Kalee remembers the world he once fought for, the people who watched their champion be torn from them. They understand the truth that the galaxy has long ignored. Grievous was created, not born. Before the war, there was Kiman Shal, a warrior raised in the unforgiving lands of Kalee. He fought not for conquest, but for survival. His people were starving, their homes reduced to ruins by an enemy that wielded far more power than they ever could. The Republic did not come to save them. The Jedi did not extend their hands in peace. Instead, they turned their backs, choosing to stand with those who had ravaged Kalee. Was that the moment he became the villain, when the Republic condemned his people, forcing them into famine and ruin? Or was it when the intergalactic banking clan extended its hand, offering him a way to feed his people in exchange for his servitude? Some say it was the moment his body was stolen from him, when the cybernetics took away his flesh, replacing his pain with circuits and wires. But in truth, it was much earlier. He was condemned long before the metal touched his bones. He was turned into what the Republic needed him to be, a monster, a force that justified the Jedi's crusade, an enemy that made it easy to ignore the Republic's own sins. He was not a Sith, not truly. He was not a believer in the Separatist cause. He did not serve Dooku because he admired him. He served because he had nowhere else to go. He had been cast out of his own existence, reduced to a weapon that others pointed at the galaxy's most powerful warriors. And when he finally fell, when Obi-Wan Kenobi ended his life on Utapau, no one mourned. There were no songs sung for the Warlord, no remembrance for the warrior he had once been. The Republic cheered. The Jedi called it a victory. And Kalee remained in ruins. His people never saw justice. In the end, what did his war change? The Republic fell, but not because of him. The Jedi were wiped from existence, but not by his hand. The Sith claimed their victory, leaving behind only ashes. And Grievous? He was simply erased, reduced to nothing but a chapter in a history written by his enemies. But Kalee still remembers. History is a weapon. It is written by those who survive, shaped by those who hold power, and told in a way that serves the victors. And in the wake of the Clone Wars, the name Grievous was molded into a grotesque legend, a cautionary tale of cruelty and mindless violence, a specter meant to justify the Republic's war and the Jedi's extinction. The Republic recorded him as a war criminal, a mass murderer who struck terror into the hearts of the innocent. His name was stripped of context, his past buried beneath the weight of propaganda. The Jedi, who once feared him, remembered only the monster, the butcher who collected their fallen warriors' lightsabers as trophies, the fiend who showed no mercy. And the Empire, the system built upon the ruins of the war he fought in, had no reason to correct the story. He was a relic of a past they no longer needed, a villain erased of purpose, remembered only for the terror he caused. What they chose to forget was the beginning. They did not remember the starving people of Kalee. They did not write about the Huk, about the Republic's blind judgment, about the suffering that made Kiman Shal into the warrior who would one day become Grievous. The official records omitted the betrayal that forced him into the banking clan's servitude, the manipulation by the Sith, and the moment his body was stolen from him. His rage was documented, but the reason for it was ignored. The galaxy found it easier to remember a mechanical warlord than the broken warrior who had been turned into one. Even the Jedi, who once prided themselves on wisdom, refused to see the truth. They feared him for his brutality, for his ability to kill even their greatest warriors. But how many of them ever wondered why he hated them? How many of them questioned why he fought with such unrelenting fury? The Order trained their knights to seek understanding, yet when they faced Grievous, they saw only a monster. None of them saw the man beneath the metal. Or perhaps they did, and ignored it, because recognizing the truth meant confronting their own failures. The galaxy never asked if Grievous had a choice, because to ask that question would be to acknowledge its own guilt. For years after his death, his name remained synonymous with terror. Stories were passed down of his brutality, his battles, his inhumanity. But among the ruins of Kalee, there were other stories. Stories of a warrior who once fought for his people, a leader who was stolen from them, a man who was never allowed to be anything more than a weapon. The galaxy chose the version of Grievous that made them feel safest, the version that painted him as nothing more than a killing machine. Because the alternative was far more unsettling, that he had once been one of them. War is a machine that grinds men into ghosts, and even in death, General Grievous remained a shadow cast over history. His name became legend, whispered in corridors of power, and cursed in Jedi temples long after he was gone. But legends are never complete. They leave behind gaps, unanswered questions that linger like the last embers of a dying fire. The war had consumed him, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but the shell of a warrior who had once fought for something greater. He had not always been a monster, though the galaxy would remember him as one. There was a time when he was Sheal, a warrior of Kalee, a leader of his people, a man who bled and suffered and fought with honor. But honor had no place in the grand game of the Sith. There were moments, subtle, hidden beneath layers of programmed rage, where something deeper flickered within him. Doubt, perhaps. Regret. Or was it simply the hollow realization that his war had long since ceased to be his own? He had believed he was reclaiming something stolen from him, but in truth, he had been reforged into a weapon for someone else's war. His hatred had been sharpened and wielded against the Jedi, but it was never truly his blade to control. The galaxy would remember the battles, the cold efficiency with which he hunted Jedi, the fear that clung to his name, his trophies, each lightsaber a story of another fallen warrior. But it would forget the desperation beneath the rage, the quiet agony of a man who had lost everything, only to be rebuilt into something that could never regain it. Would he have made different choices if the Republic had not turned its back on Kalee? If Dooku had never whispered his poison into his mind? If he had never stepped onto that shuttle, never become the broken thing they rebuilt? Such questions had no answers. There was no alternate path, no unbroken road that led to peace. He had been caught in a tide far greater than himself, swept toward a fate that had been decided the moment his planet was abandoned to rot. His war ended on Utapau, but his story did not die there. It carried forward in the scars he left on the galaxy, in the soldiers who remembered his tactics, in the warriors who feared to speak his name. His death was not a victory. It was a silence, a void where a warlord once stood. But what remained of Sheal in those final moments? Had he already died long before Obi-Wan Kenobi fired that last shot? Had the man who once fought for Kalee disappeared the moment they carved away his flesh? The Republic would say yes. The Jedi would say yes. The Sith would say yes. But the truth was more complicated, buried beneath the cold metal and raging fire. Somewhere beneath the cough, beneath the hatred, beneath the legend itself, perhaps something of the warrior he once was had endured. And perhaps that was the real tragedy of General Grievous. Power is a currency that few can truly control. It corrupts, twists, and consumes, leaving behind only shadows of the men who sought to wield it. General Grievous, in life and in death, became a cautionary tale of what happens when power is granted without control, when rage is sharpened into a weapon wielded by unseen hands. His legacy was built upon war, but war had never truly belonged to him. His story was one of ambition turned to tragedy, of revenge that became indistinguishable from servitude. He had been a warlord, a hero, a butcher, a pawn, all these identities tangled into one, and yet beneath the cold durasteel plating and the chilling rasp of his breath, there had once been a man with dreams beyond war. Before the banking clan, before Dooku, before the final betrayal, there had been Sheal, the warrior of Kalee, fighting for the survival of his people. He had not asked to be reforged into a monster. That decision had been made for him, by those who saw his rage as an opportunity. The Jedi called him a war criminal, a mindless killer with no honor, yet they had played a role in his fall. The Republic saw him as another enemy to be crushed, not as a symptom of the corruption rotting its core. The Sith viewed him as an asset, a tool to be discarded when his usefulness ran out. Even history itself failed him, reducing him to a name on old battle records, a terrifying specter from a war that few even understood. But what had it all been for? His war against the Jedi had ended with his body burned away in the dirt of Utapau. His people remained forgotten, still suffering under the weight of the Republic's betrayal. And when the Empire rose, Kalee saw no salvation. He had slaughtered Jedi, torn apart Republic forces, conquered entire systems in the name of Separatist victory, yet, in the end, it was all for nothing. The war was never about Kalee. It was never about justice. It had always been a performance orchestrated by those far beyond his reach, with Palpatine at the center of it all. If power was the goal, then what had it truly given him? Strength without purpose, rage without resolution, war without victory. He had become stronger than any Kaleesh warrior in history, yet he had lost the very thing that had once made him who he was. Power had not saved him. It had stripped him of everything. And so his legacy remained a contradiction. To the Republic, He was a monster to be feared, to the Sith, a pawn that had served its purpose, and to his own people, a lost son who had been used and discarded by a galaxy that had never cared for them in the first place. The weight of his choices, his victories, his failures, all led to the same place. A grave with no name, a legacy twisted beyond recognition. There was no redemption, no last-minute clarity, no moment of triumph, only silence. Perhaps that was the true price of power. It promised strength but demanded surrender. It offered control but took away freedom. It whispered of victory but delivered only chains. Grievous had been a master of war, but he had never been its owner. The war had owned him, consumed him, reforged him into something that was no longer truly Kalee, no longer truly alive. His hands, once meant to wield the weapons of his ancestors, had been replaced by cold metal extensions of someone else's design. His mind, once sharp with the instincts of a hunter, had been twisted by programming and deception. His breath, once steady and strong in the heat of battle, had been reduced to a rasping, mechanical imitation of life. Power had not made him invincible. It had only made him useful to those who had no need for him once his purpose was fulfilled. His body was built to survive, but survival had never been the same as freedom. What was he without war? Could he have ever been anything else? Had there been a moment, buried beneath the years of bloodshed, where he could have turned away? Or had his fate been sealed from the moment his body was broken in that shuttle explosion, from the moment his mind was poisoned with Sith deceit? The galaxy had moved on. The Jedi were gone, but not by his hand. The war had ended, but not in his favor. His masters had reshaped the Republic into the Empire, but he had no place in it. They had left him behind in the past, a relic of a conflict that had already been decided before he had even drawn his first blade. Perhaps that was the cruelest truth of all. His war had never truly mattered. He had fought, he had killed, he had conquered, but the galaxy had never been changed by his efforts. It had always belonged to others. History would not mourn him. His name would not be spoken with reverence or understanding. The children of Kalee would hear of him in whispers, tales of the warrior who had once fought for them, but had been lost to something larger, something beyond their grasp. The Empire would not acknowledge him, save for the echoes of his tactics still carried through their military. The Jedi who had feared him, who had fought against him, would see him only as another nightmare from their long, doomed struggle against the darkness. In the end, all that remained of General Grievous was dust, scattered across a world that had never meant anything to him. His legacy lived on, but only in the hands of those who had never known his name, never understood his suffering, never cared for his cause. There was no statue in his honor, no memorial of his sacrifice. The Republic did not commemorate his death, and the Sith did not celebrate his service. He had existed only for war, and when the war ended, so did any reason for him to remain. If he had known in his final moments that all of it had led here, if he had known that his strength would mean nothing in the long run, that his power would vanish the moment he was no longer needed, would he have fought just as fiercely, or would he have let go? Would he have seen the truth for what it was, or had he always known? Perhaps in the final seconds, as the fire burned through his chest and the weight of his metal limbs gave way, he had realized that there had never been victory waiting for him at the end of his war. Only this, only silence.